So those of you out there, maybe not all of you are writers, but this is a writers conference. Certainly you're all readers. We all know that it takes a lot of apprenticeship to the writing craft to be a good writer. By that I mean learning how to write, sentences that move us and that move the story forward or that make sense. Writing scenes and paragraphs and chapters and books and on and on and on. And so in every way, that is really important to, apprentice yourself to the craft. And I think that, like, I have done that. I'm 52 now. I have been doing that since I was a teenager, really quite seriously since I was about 19 or 20. And that's really important work, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today, because I think that for me, when I think about how did I become a writer? What is it taken, what tests have I been given over and over again as a writer? A lot of them are about craft, yes. A lot of them are, how do I make this scene work? How do I write that chapter or that book? Okay. But a lot of it is also this other piece of writing, what I call, in a general sense, heart. When I teach writing workshops that last more than 20 minutes, I always teach a kind of two-pronged workshop. One is craft, tending to all those things that I just mentioned, and one is heart, craft and heart. And by heart, what I mean is all of that stuff it takes for us, in order for writers to actually succeed at doing the work, and also writing work that reaches and touches and moves other people. And there's no way around the fact, I've learned, you have to put your human self into that work you do. And that demands a lot of things from us as people. It demands a kind of self-interrogation. It demands courage. It demands that we are vulnerable on the page. And that's what I want to talk about today. Of course, those of you who know my work will not be surprised by this, right? As Dear Sugar, I'm constantly talking about the ways that we have to take emotional risks, how we have to be brave enough to risk becoming exposed in front of others. And I think writing is all about that. So I'm going to talk about very quickly over these next, I guess now 18 minutes or so, 16 minutes or so, about the elements of writing with heart. I think of them, there are 5 things, okay? I'm getting all kinds of weird messages on my computer. I just want to make sure you can all still hear me. Everything's okay still? Yes, okay. Those 5 things that I think it takes to write with heart are clarity, courage, consciousness, persistence, and love. You have to write with clarity, courage, consciousness, persistence, and love to succeed. That is what I have found. So let's begin with that first one, clarity. It seems like the kind of simplest one, and maybe because it is, and yet I think in so many ways, making a vow every day to write with clarity is like one of the hardest things that I do, and that so many writers I know do. What I mean by it is simply being able to sit in acceptance with the fact that you can do this, that you're worthy of doing this, that inner voice in your head, I call it your inner terrible someone, your yitz, who very often pipes up and says, nobody really wants to hear from you. Oh, that story's been told before. You're not original. Nobody wants to hear stories from your category of people. Whatever it is that your voice, that yitz says to yourself every day, every maybe not every day. They talk to me every day. You have to be clear about overcoming it. You have to be clear that your mission, your call, your work is to tell the story you have to tell, to put the words on the page that you have to write, or the screen, if you will. That you are that powerful voice within you that says you want to write is a more important call than the terrible voice who says you can't, you won't, nobody will ever read it. Clarity is something I wrestle with every day, that I have to over and over again. I know a lot of people don't believe this is true, but it is, that in some ways, even after I've had success as a writer, I have to be more clear about my call to write. because there is that fear, it's very real, and that voice within me that says, I can't. And so you have to trust your clarity in order to write. That is the first thing. And what I've done is I've really accepted that this is part of my process, that I have to sort of banish the voice of the its in order to do my work. So get comfortable with having to feel uncomfortable in doing the work. The next one, when you can write with that clarity, when you can embrace that sense of mission to do this, is to write with courage. And by courage, I really mean, again, in my work as Dear Sugar, I have so often talked about how we have to revise the story of certain meanings in our lives. And for me, courage is not about going to battle against something and winning. It's actually, in so many ways, a very different kind of posture. It's saying, I'm going to be courageous enough to be vulnerable. I'm going to be courageous enough to risk being exposed. I'm going to be courageous enough to not just tell the truth, but to dig deeper, to dig beneath that truth, to tell the truest version I can bear to tell, to be as transparent as possible. Now, a lot of times that is, when people hear me talking like that, they think I mean, oh yeah, you got to expose all your secrets, which of course, in some ways you do have to. If you're writing memoir, you probably do, but I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about truth, whether you're writing fiction or poetry or plays or essays, nonfiction, fiction, any genre. It does require you to very much excavate all of your assumptions or your received narratives, the things that you've always wanted to believe about yourself or others or the world. Our job as writers is to be the truth tellers, and there is no way to tell the truth without being courageous and vulnerable and risking what we all fear, which I think is condemnation and judgment. One of the things I'll tell you about courage, because this comes up all the time, especially when I teach memoir, is, oh my gosh, what if people think this, that, or the other thing of me? What if I'm judged for this? And what I can tell you, as somebody who has written in ways that really are vulnerable and really are, I write fiction too, but also in my nonfiction, I've written about myself. I can just tell you that you will receive some condemnation when you expose yourself. You will also receive a lot of love, a lot of people saying, me too. I didn't know that other people felt that way. I do too. And there's a lot of power. It makes you braver when people step forward and say, I'm with you. One of my favorite quotes, I'm going to put on my glasses so I can read it. One of my favorite quotes by one of my favorite writers, James Baldwin. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive or who had ever been alive. That's powerful stuff. That's what I mean about being brave. You think that if you write with courage and vulnerability, people will turn away from you because they'll judge you. But in fact, James Baldwin is right. It will connect you. It will connect you to our humanity, to everyone who's ever lived. That's powerful stuff. So step into it. Being brave, that's the other thing about when you start writing courageously, being brave makes you braver. So a lot of times when people ask me about the stories I tell as Dear Sugar in my book, Tiny Beautiful Things, and now on my Substack newsletter, or the stories I told in Wild, people will say, or any number of my essays, people will say, oh my gosh, how could you say that about yourself? And what I say is like, well, I worked my way up to this. This is something I've been working. This is apprenticing myself the same way I apprenticed myself in figuring out how to write a good sentence. I apprenticed myself in figuring out how to be brave on the page or on the screen. Okay, rule 3. It's not a rule, but value 3 in how you write with heart. Write with humble persistence. Okay, so there's 2 parts of this: humble and persistence. And this is a really important one for me. Now, obviously, we know we need to persist. Writing is not a short game. It's something that we have to stick with over a long time. That most times, you don't like start writing and then there you are. You've got millions of people reading your work. There's some real practice with that, but humility is part of it too, a really important part of it. When I was writing my first book, a novel called Torch, I wanted to write the best book that had ever been written. I had such high ambitions. I read all the writers I loved, and I was like, I want to write a book like their book. And there was a certain point about midway through, I'd written maybe about 3/4 of the book, that I just stopped, and I just was avoiding my writing. I was lying. I was like, "Oh yeah, I worked all day." Didn't work all day. Watched TV, watched, terrible cable reality shows, actually a show called Baby Story. Um, and I just avoided the work. And what I realized I was doing is I had this opportunity to finish my novel, this thing I said that I wanted all my life. And what was I doing every day? I wasn't doing it. I wasn't doing it. I wasn't doing it. Um, and what I had to realize is that the reason I wasn't doing it is that I hadn't gotten humble enough. That humble persistence, I hadn't yet learned what that meant in my writing life. Here's what it meant. It meant that I had to surrender everything except the mission of getting the book done. I had to say, maybe I am going to finish this novel and it will be terrible and nobody will want to read it and nobody will want to publish it. Or if it is published, everyone will hate it. I had to actually surrender myself to that possibility. I call this surrendering yourself to mediocrity. What I had to do is say, I might write a mediocre novel. I have to forget the idea, this big dream I had of writing a great book. I have to surrender that idea to the idea of getting it done. So I surrendered to my own mediocrity. And once I did that, I liberated myself. I was humbly persistent in the only mission that mattered, which was finish this book. Do what you said you were going to do. Do it. I did it. I did it. And the day I finished Torch is honestly one of the happiest days of my life. And so many beautiful, exciting, fabulous things happened to me in my writing life after that. But I have to tell you, finishing that first book was perhaps the very biggest one, because it was the one where I was just between me and myself and I said, I did it. I said I was going to do it. I said this was my dream and I made my dream happen. And no matter now what happens to this, whatever happens to this book in the world, not my fault, not my job, not my business. It is my business, but it's not really my concern. My concern was getting it done. So write with that kind of humble persistence, surrender to everything but getting it done. Now, that doesn't mean don't try to do your best. My God, of course, try to do your best, but don't let that kind of idea of who you should be get in the way of who you need to become. Okay? So the last two. Okay, how much time do we have left? Are we running out of time? Okay, I've got 6 minutes to tell you about the last two aspects here. Okay, write with consciousness. What does this mean? This means that every story you tell, every image you write, every line you put down, in some ways has to be rooted both deeply into who you are and your vision, right? But also it has to have consciousness of humanity. Like what is the story you're telling about who we are? You don't have to, in every word, tell the story, tell every story about who we are, but you have to write with a consciousness that the story you're telling has power far beyond you. And then impart the reason for telling it has power far beyond you. One of the things that really has struck me in seeing the way Wild went around the world and people were identifying with it and saying, "Oh, me too. I relate to you. I relate to the grief. I relate to the journey. I relate to the overcoming obstacles. I relate to the going in unprepared. All of those things. Being kind of uncomfortable and having to find yourself outside that comfort zone. All of those things." That I just named, those are all universal stories. And so even though I was writing a really personal story in Wild, what I was conscious of as I was writing that book is that I was telling a story that was about all of us, right? When I wrote this scene, if you guys read the book or saw the movie, that scene where I pack my pack for the first time and it's so damn heavy that I can't lift it. Wow. I realized when I wrote that scene, okay, this is it. This is why I can write this book, because I'm telling a story, in real literal terms. I was telling a story about a woman who had to bear something she couldn't bear. I had to bear that backpack I could not bear. In a larger sense, I was writing about how I couldn't bear my grief. I couldn't bear the idea of living my life without my mother. But the minute I tapped into that and realized I was telling a story about bearing what we cannot bear, I knew I had the consciousness that I was telling a human story, because every one of you listening to this has had to bear something you can't bear. And if you've been lucky enough not to face that yet, it's coming, because to be human is to have to suffer. To be human is to have to say, I have to live with this thing that I think I cannot live with. I have to carry this weight I think I cannot carry. And so I wrote into that. So in your writing, always think about that. Go deep within the self, whether it be about a character or if it's you on the page, and try to think in an more expansive way about how does that connect. How does your story connect to the human story? I always, when I'm teaching writing, I always say, what's the question, what's the particular question at the core of your story, and what's the universal question at the core of your story? For me in Wild, it was like, how can I live without my mother? How can I hike this trail that seems impossible and too hard? Those were the particular questions that character was confronting. The universal story at the core of Wild is, how do we bear what we cannot bear? How do we go on when we think we cannot go on? Okay. So write with that kind of consciousness, big consciousness. We're doing important work here when we write. Okay, lastly, this is a big one. It's such an important one. And it's one that really, this is how Dear Sugar was born. It is write with love, write with love. Literally harness the love that is in your heart. It is the most powerful tool available to any of us. Use it. Write with all of your emotional intelligence. Write with all of every bit of kindness and compassion and bigness and generosity you can possibly muster. The most expansive version of yourself is the one that will be the most moving, the most interesting, the most powerful on the screen or the page. I promise you that. And I don't mean love like la la love like flowers and Valentine's Day and stuff. I mean, the love that you feel in your body when you actually come to grips with everything and you accept the gifts that you've received in all the ways, whether it be from the good love, the bad love, the painful things, the losses, the gains, the triumphs, the things that will never be okay. All of that I think filters through our hearts and allows us to become who we are. And when we can do that thing where we actually look at our lives and say, I'm grateful for everything. I'm grateful for the things, the lessons I learned the hard way, the lessons I learned the easy way, the gifts that were given to me with beauty and grace and light, and the gifts that were given to me like a punch in the gut and a slash in the face, right? If you can accept all of that and learn from it and make those things your teachers and then write from that place of wisdom, I do think that comes out as love. I do think that comes out as love. That is what I try to do as Dear Sugar. One of the things I wrote about in the original Sugar column, which is collected in Tiny Beautiful Things, if you haven't read that, please go get that book. Is that I think that that really, what I made Dear Sugar from my saddest, hardest place. My mom died really suddenly when she was 45 of cancer. She was the love of my life, as I wrote in one of my essays. Her death devastated me. I didn't think I could go on. And I realized I could. And not only that I had to make something beautiful of the ugliest thing in my life. I had to make something beautiful of the ugliest thing in my life. That's what we get to do as writers. That's what I mean when I say write with love. So, I wrote Dear Sugar is the temple I built in my own obliterated place, the obliterated place that was left when my mom died. And so here I am now, all these years later, still writing Dear Sugar and writing it on Substack. Thank you all for listening to this talk. Check me out on Substack. I send out a Dear Sugar letter every month, and I might do a bonus one every now and then. Please subscribe, and thank you for tuning in today. Happy trails, dear hearts. And maybe I'll answer questions. I don't know. I'm happy to do that.
I do have one question for you. I don't want to keep you too long, but we really appreciate you taking the time. This is a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you.
One of the things you talk about a lot, and it resonates with me as a writer, is the idea of being vulnerable and taking risks. And I wonder, to what degree is that complicated by the age of social media that we live in, when your view of humanity is influenced by, for instance, Twitter, which a lot of writers spend a lot of time on, and you also get humanity's view of you back, or at
Yeah.
least a warped version of that view, and it can mess with your mind and can mess with your ability to, or willingness to take those risks and to be vulnerable. So how do you, as a writer, deal with that and live with that in your life? And what's your advice to other budding writers on how to manage that sort of mental chaos?
Yeah, no, it's a fabulous question because it is also something that has, it's changed in my own lifetime. When I first started publishing, there were ways for people to give me feedback. They could write a letter, and it was at the beginning like of email and stuff. But yeah, you're right. Now it's you get lots of feedback very quickly, both praise and condemnation, right? And so I don't have the answer for it, but what I can tell you is there are a couple strategies that I've just really embraced, and that is, you know, I cannot read everything. I cannot read like the negative feedback I get to my writing. What I try to do to the best of my ability is to not, I don't go on Amazon and read the reviews. I don't read the positive reviews or the negative reviews. So, like the old trope, don't read the comments. I truly don't. Now it's a little bit different, on my Substack page because it is subscribers and they're, so that's a different kind of thing. But yeah, out in the wild world of social media and on different websites, you have to sort of learn how to turn away to protect yourself. I also think it's really important to keep a broader perspective, and it's this. There's no writing that everyone loves. Okay. Every novel that any of us could say, like, this is the best novel, it's my favorite novel, there's somebody out there who says that is the worst book I've ever read. So as a writer, I try to remember that like, okay, I'm doing well if 80% of the people who have something to say about my work say something positive, lucky me. And those 20% get to say whatever they want to say. And it's not a reflection on what I'm doing. I can't please 100% of the people. It's not our job to do that. And so to try to both protect yourself and also accept that criticism is part of this work, that nobody loves everything. And there are ways now in social media that people who don't love it can very loudly let you know. But our work is to be as brave and truth telling as possible regardless of that.